What if I told you the most important health threat to your life after the age of 65 isn't heart disease or cancer, it's loneliness. And what's not being talked about is that the largest group of people in America that die from this are men over the age of 65. If you're retired and think you could just slide into this phase of life, you could be walking into the deadliest trap ever.
There is a decade that most people never see coming. Not because it's hidden. Not because the science is unclear, but because nobody talks about it. Not your doctor. Not your parents. Not the system that was supposed to prepare you for it. And by the time you're standing inside it, the ground is already moving. I want you to think about something for a moment. When people talk about aging, they almost always jump straight to the very end. The final years. The hospital bed. The slow goodbye. But what if I told you that the most dangerous, the most destabilizing, the most quietly devastating stretch of a human life isn't at the very end at all? What if the real crisis happens earlier? Between 65 and 75. That specific 10-year window is where the body, the mind, the identity, the finances, and the relationships of millions of people face their most severe simultaneous pressure. Not one thing going wrong. Everything shifting at once. And the research backs this up in ways that are genuinely difficult to sit with once you understand them. I have spent years watching what happens to people in this stage of life. And the pattern is consistent enough to be alarming. The people who walk into this decade without understanding what is coming are the ones who get swallowed by it. The people who understand it, who see it clearly before it arrives, they are the ones who come out the other side with something most people never expect to find after 75. Peace. Real, settled, earned peace. Hi viewers, here is my question for you today. Are you between the ages of 65 and 75 right now, or do you have a parent or loved one going through this stage of life? Drop your answer in the comments below. I read every single one. Because here is what the evidence is showing us. This is not a story about getting old. This is a story about a specific biological and psychological storm that arrives right at the moment most people believe they have finally earned the right to rest. You work for 40 years. You sacrifice. You plan. You count down the days. And then retirement arrives, and instead of relief, something else shows up at the door entirely. The numbers are stark. Depression rates climb sharply in this exact age bracket. Chronic illness diagnoses cluster in this window more than any other. Marriages that survived decades begin to fracture. Savings that look sufficient on paper begin to disappear faster than anyone projected. And underneath all of it, a kind of loneliness that most people in this decade describe as the most profound of their entire lives. But here is the part that never makes it into the conversation. None of this is inevitable. That is the thing that genuinely matters. The suffering that happens in this decade is not simply a natural and unavoidable tax on getting older. A significant portion of it is the direct consequence of a society that has completely failed to prepare people for what this stage of life actually demands. We prepare children for adolescence with education and guidance. We prepare young adults for careers and marriage with entire industries built around support. And then we hand people a retirement card, a gold watch, and a calendar full of silence, and we say nothing. Nothing about what is coming biologically. Nothing about what tends to happen psychologically. Nothing about the financial traps that are about to open up beneath them. That silence is not neutral. That silence costs lives. And I am not willing to stay quiet about it. Over the course of this video, we are going to go through exactly what happens in this decade and why it is so uniquely hard. We will talk about the body first, because the physical changes in this window are happening faster and with more consequence than most people realize. Then we will talk about identity, because the psychological shift that comes with leaving a working life is something the medical community is only beginning to take seriously. We will talk about loneliness, which is now classified as a genuine public health crisis with a measurable biological impact on your body. We will talk about money, Because the financial architecture of this decade is built on assumptions that almost never survive contact with reality. And at the very end, we will arrive at the one thing that quietly drives all of it. The single factor that determines whether this decade destroys you or transforms you. Stay with me. Because the fifth and final point on this list essentially contains everything else. And when we get there, it is going to reframe everything you thought you knew about what aging actually means. This is not a conversation about decline. This is a conversation about the most misunderstood decade in human life. And understanding it, truly understanding it, might be the most important thing you do today. Let's start with the body. Because before anything else shifts in this decade, before the identity questions arrive, and the financial pressure builds, and the loneliness sets in, the body begins its own quiet negotiation. And it does not ask for your permission. Here is what the research tells us. The years between 65 and 75 are not simply a continuation of the gradual aging process that began in your 40s. This is something different. This is the window where multiple biological systems begin to decline simultaneously. Not one at a time. Not slowly and predictably. All at once. And the timing is not a coincidence. It is biology following a pattern that scientists have now documented with enough consistency to call it a threshold. Think of it this way. For decades, your body has been absorbing damage. Small injuries at the cellular level. Inflammation quietly building. Arterial walls gradually stiffening. Muscle fibers slowly thinning. And your body, being the extraordinary system that it is, has been compensating. Patching. Rerouting. Adapting. You felt mostly fine because the reserves were holding. Between 65 and 75, the reserves run out. The cardiovascular system is often the first place this becomes visible. The heart muscle itself becomes less efficient at filling and pumping with the same force it once had. The blood vessels lose elasticity. Blood pressure becomes harder to regulate. And this is not just a matter of feeling tired more easily. Cardiovascular changes in this decade directly increase the risk of stroke, heart failure, and kidney disease. Often all three are connected. Pull one thread, and the others begin to unravel. Then there is what happens to muscle. Sarcopenia is the medical term for the accelerated loss of muscle mass that sets in during this decade. And the statistics around it are genuinely striking. From the age of 65 onward, the average person loses between 1 and 2% of their muscle mass every single year without intervention. That sounds modest. It is not. Because muscle is not just about strength. Muscle is metabolically active tissue. It regulates your blood sugar. It protects your joints. It keeps you upright and balanced. When it goes, it takes several other systems with it. Falls become more likely. Blood sugar control worsens. The risk of developing type 2 diabetes increases. And perhaps most critically, the loss of muscle mass in this decade is one of the strongest predictors of mortality in the following decade. This is the part that changes how you see everything. The choices made between 65 and 75 do not just affect how you feel at 70. They determine the entire trajectory of your 80s. Whether you are living independently at 82 or relying entirely on others for basic daily function is a question that is being answered right now, inside this decade, often without people realizing it. And then the immune system begins to shift. There is a term in immunology called immunosenescence. It refers to the gradual deterioration of immune function that accelerates in older age. In this decade, the immune system becomes less precise. It becomes slower to identify genuine threats and simultaneously more likely to produce low-grade chronic inflammation even when there is no infection present. That chronic inflammation is not a background inconvenience. It is now understood to be a driving mechanism behind Alzheimer's disease, certain cancers, cardiovascular disease, and arthritis. The immune system that spent decades protecting you begins to contribute to the very conditions it was supposed to prevent. Stop for a moment and sit with that. Your own defense system, the one that carried you through every illness and injury of your life, begins to work against you in this window. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily and measurably. And then comes the medication cascade. This is something I want you to pay close attention to because it is one of the least discussed dangers of this decade. As multiple systems begin to show strain simultaneously, doctors prescribe medications to manage each one. Blood pressure medication, cholesterol medication, blood sugar medication, medication for joint pain, medication for sleep. And here is the problem. Each of those medications was studied largely in isolation. The research on how 5 or 6 of them interact inside one aging body over many years is far thinner than most people assume. Drug interactions in older adults are responsible for a significant and underreported number of hospitalizations every single year. The treatment of one condition can quietly worsen another. And the person taking all of these medications is often managing the side effects of the medications themselves, sometimes without realizing that is what is happening. This is not an argument against medication. Medication saves lives and manages conditions that would otherwise be debilitating. This is an argument for awareness, for asking questions, for understanding that the body in this decade needs to be understood as a system, not a collection of separate problems to be managed in separate rooms. But here is what I need you to understand before we move forward. None of what I have just described is a fixed sentence. The research on this is equally clear in the other direction. Regular resistance exercise, the kind that directly challenges your muscles, has been shown to significantly slow sarcopenia even when started in the late 60s. Anti-inflammatory nutrition patterns have a measurable impact on immune function. Managing sleep, which deteriorates in this decade for its own set of biological reasons, has downstream effects on nearly every system I have just described. The body in this decade is not finished. It is asking for a different kind of attention than it needed before. The question is whether you are listening. Because while your body is navigating all of this, something else is happening at the same time. Something that the medical system is even less equipped to address. Something that sits not in the blood or the muscle or the arteries, but in the part of you that asks the question that becomes impossible to ignore once the noise of a working life goes quiet. Who am I now? That question is coming. And for millions of people in this decade, the answer they find is far more devastating than any physical diagnosis. When you have worked for 40 years, your identity and your occupation become so deeply fused that most people cannot tell where one ends and the other begins. You are not just someone who teaches or builds or manages or heals. You are a teacher. You are a builder. You are a manager. You are a healer. The job is not what you do. It becomes, quietly and completely, who you are. And then one day it stops. Retirement is sold to us as freedom. The finish line. The reward for all the years of early mornings and long commutes and sacrifices made. And for some people, for a short window, it genuinely feels that way. The first few months can carry a kind of holiday lightness. Sleeping in, traveling, doing the things there was never time for. But research published across multiple long-term studies tells a different story about what tends to follow. Within the first 1 to 2 years of retirement, rates of clinical depression increase significantly. One major study tracking over 400,000 people found that retirees were 40% more likely to experience depression than those still working. Another found that cognitive decline accelerated in individuals after retirement in a way that was not explained by age alone. The structure, the mental engagement, the daily social contact, the sense of being needed and of mattering, when all of that disappears at once, the brain and the nervous system register something that functions almost like loss. Because that is exactly what it is. It is grief. Quiet, socially invisible grief for a version of yourself that no longer exists. And here is the part that makes it harder. Nobody gives you permission to grieve it. You are supposed to be happy. You earned this. Everyone around you is congratulating you. So the grief has nowhere to go. It turns inward. It becomes confusion, then restlessness, then a flatness that some people describe as the strangest feeling of their lives. Not sadness exactly, more like a question mark where a person used to be. Men and women tend to experience this differently, and the research reflects that. For men, who in many cases built their entire sense of worth and social connection through their professional identity, retirement can trigger a psychological free fall that they are almost entirely unprepared for. Studies show that men are significantly less likely to have maintained deep friendships outside of the workplace. When the workplace disappears, the social world often disappears with it. The isolation that follows is not just uncomfortable. It is dangerous in ways we will come to shortly. For women, the experience often involves a different, but equally destabilizing collision. Many women in this generation carry the double weight of professional careers and primary caregiving responsibilities simultaneously. Retirement can bring an expectation, sometimes self-imposed, and sometimes coming from family, that the caregiving simply continues and expands. Looking after grandchildren, managing the household, being the emotional anchor for adult children navigating their own pressures. The freedom that retirement was supposed to deliver never quite arrives. And underneath all of this, for both men and women, runs a current that nobody prepares you for. The body is changing. We already established that. But the way those physical changes interact with identity is something that deserves its own moment. When you can no longer do the things that define you physically, when the energy is not what it was, when the body requires more attention and delivers less, it does not just feel like a physical limitation. It feels like a shrinking, like the borders of who you are getting smaller and closer. There is a concept in psychology called role exit theory. It describes what happens to a person's sense of self when a major social role ends. And what the research consistently shows is that the people who navigate this transition most successfully are not the ones who had the most money or the best health going in. They are the ones who had developed what psychologists call identity flexibility, the capacity to build meaning and purpose from multiple sources simultaneously, so that when one source is removed, the architecture does not collapse. Most people in this decade were never taught how to do that. And that absence, that gap in preparation, is not a personal failure. It is a systemic one. But the consequences land personally. Every time. Now I want to be honest with you about something before we continue. Everything I have described so far, the physical threshold and the identity crisis, these things do not happen in separate rooms. They happen in the same body, at the same time, feeding each other. A person who is losing their physical capacity is also losing parts of their identity. A person who is grieving their professional self is also more likely to neglect the physical habits that could protect them. The biological and the psychological are not parallel tracks in this decade. They are the same track. Which means that what comes next makes both of them worse. Because while the body is crossing its threshold and the identity is searching for solid ground, something is quietly happening to the social world around a person in this decade. And the research on what it does to the human body is some of the most startling I have ever encountered. We are not designed to be alone. This is not a sentiment. It is a biological fact with measurable consequences. The human nervous system evolved over hundreds of thousands of years in conditions of social connection. Isolation is not processed by the brain as uncomfortable. It is processed as a threat. A genuine survival-level threat. And it activates the same stress response systems as physical danger. In this decade, loneliness does not creep in gently. For many people, it arrives like a door closing. Colleagues who were a daily presence for decades disappear the moment the job ends. Friends who were connected through shared routines drift when the routines stop. And then the harder losses begin. In this decade, people start losing their peers. Not metaphorically. Literally. Friends who were healthy last year receive diagnosis. Some do not make it through this decade at all. And every loss does two things simultaneously. It removes another thread from the social fabric of a person's life. And it delivers a reminder of mortality that cannot be unfelt. The research from Dr. Julianne Holt-Lunstad at Brigham Young University, which has now been replicated and expanded across multiple countries and populations, found that the health impact of social isolation is comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. That is not a metaphor designed to get your attention. That is a documented biological finding. Chronic loneliness elevates inflammatory markers in the blood. It disrupts sleep architecture. It raises cortisol. It increases blood pressure. It suppresses immune function. Every system we already identified as vulnerable in this decade is made measurably worse by isolation. Think about what that means. A person who retires, loses their professional identity, begins to experience the physical changes of this decade, and simultaneously loses their social network is not just feeling sad. Their body is responding to all of that as a compounding biological emergency. And the healthcare system they turn to is almost entirely focused on the physical symptoms. The blood pressure, the blood sugar, the joint pain. Almost nobody asks about the loneliness. Almost nobody measures it. Almost nobody treats it. And marriages, the relationships that were supposed to be the anchor through all of this, face their own severe test in this decade. Here is something that surprises people. Divorce rates among adults over 65 have been climbing steadily for years. Researchers call it gray divorce. And when you understand the dynamics of this decade, it is not actually surprising at all. Two people who spent decades running parallel lives, connected by the rhythm of work and children and shared obligations, suddenly find themselves in the same space, all day, every day, with no external structure to absorb the friction. Issues that were always present but manageable in smaller doses become impossible to avoid. And for couples who built their connection around function rather than genuine intimacy, the silence of retirement can feel unbearable. For those who lose a partner in this decade, the consequences are severe. Widowhood in this age window is one of the strongest predictors of rapid health decline on record. The loss of a life partner does not just cause emotional suffering. It removes the person who was often managing medications, attending appointments, monitoring nutrition, and providing the daily human contact that kept the nervous system regulated. The health consequences of spousal loss in this decade can manifest within months, and they are real, measurable, and well documented. But I want to say something important here. Loneliness in this decade is not inevitable. It is predictable. And predictable problems can be addressed before they arrive. The research is equally clear that social connection, even when rebuilt in later life, has a protective biological effect. Community involvement, group physical activity, volunteering, faith communities, even consistent digital connection with family members, all of these have been shown to reduce inflammatory markers and improve outcomes across the board. The problem is not that solutions do not exist. The problem is that people arrive at this decade without a plan, without having thought about it, without having been warned. And while the body is changing and the identity is searching and the social world is contracting, there is one more pressure building in the background of this decade. One that most people did not see coming clearly enough. One that turns all of the above from difficult into genuinely destabilizing. The money. Retirement was supposed to be the reward. The savings were supposed to be enough. The calculations made at 55 were supposed to hold. They often do not. And what happens inside the financial architecture of this decade is something that deserves to be spoken about with complete honesty, because the gap between what people expect and what they actually encounter is one of the defining sources of suffering in this stage of life. Here is the sequence as it tends to unfold. A person retires with a pension, some savings, perhaps some investments. The projections looked reasonable at the time they were made. But those projections were built on assumptions. Assumptions about health costs. Assumptions about how long the money would need to last. Assumptions about inflation. And in almost every case, at least one of those assumptions turns out to be wrong in a way that costs significantly more than anticipated. Healthcare costs in this decade are not a minor line item. They are often the dominant one. In the United States, The average retired couple is estimated to need over $300,000 to cover healthcare costs alone across retirement. That figure does not include long-term care. It does not include the cost of home modifications to accommodate reduced mobility. It does not include the informal costs borne by family members who reduce their own working hours to provide care. In countries with public healthcare systems, the direct costs are lower, but the indirect costs and the gaps in coverage are often larger than people assumed when they stopped working. And here is where it becomes a cycle that is genuinely difficult to break. Financial stress is not just a psychological burden. It is a biological one. Chronic financial anxiety elevates cortisol levels. Cortisol, when elevated consistently over time, promotes inflammation, disrupts sleep, impairs immune function, and accelerates cognitive decline. The very stress of worrying about money in this decade actively worsens the health conditions that are generating the costs in the first place. Stress creates illness. Illness creates costs. Costs create stress. And around it goes. The people caught inside that cycle are often too exhausted and too frightened to see it clearly. They are managing symptoms, taking more medications, attending more appointments, watching the savings move in one direction. And the gap between the retirement they imagined and the reality they are living in widens in a way that carries its own grief, its own quiet humiliation, its own damage to identity and self-worth. There is also something that financial planners rarely factor in and families rarely discuss openly: the emotional cost of dependence. For a generation that defined itself through self-sufficiency, through providing rather than receiving, the moment when financial reality requires leaning on adult children or accessing state support is not just a practical transition. It carries a psychological weight that can be genuinely crushing. Pride, shame, the fear of being a burden. These are not irrational feelings. They are the entirely predictable consequences of a value system built over a lifetime colliding with a reality that nobody adequately prepared for. And adult children, navigating their own financial pressures, their own mortgages and childcare costs and career demands, often find themselves caught between their own needs and the needs of aging parents in ways that generate guilt, resentment, and exhaustion on every side of the equation. Nobody is to blame. The system simply never built a bridge between these two generations at this particular crossing point. But here is what I want you to hold on to before we arrive at the final piece of this picture. The financial trap of this decade, as real and as serious as it is also one of the most preventable. Not entirely. Not for everyone. Economic inequality means that some people enter this decade with far fewer resources than others, and I am not going to pretend that good planning eliminates that structural reality. But for a significant number of people, the financial damage of this decade is worsened substantially by the absence of honest, early, and specific preparation. Not general retirement planning. Specific preparation for the healthcare cost curve. For the inflation of care needs over time. For the emotional dimensions of dependence. For the conversations with family that feel uncomfortable now but become essential later. The window to have those conversations is before this decade arrives. Not during it. And now we have reached the place I told you about at the beginning. The umbrella. Because everything I have described across this entire video, the physical threshold and the identity earthquake and the loneliness and the financial pressure, all of it, every single layer of it, shares one root cause. One common thread running through the suffering of millions of people in this decade that is almost never named directly. Unpreparedness. Not physical decline. Decline is real, but it is not the enemy. Not aging itself. Aging is inevitable, but it is not what causes the damage. The damage is caused by the complete and systemic failure of our culture to prepare people honestly and specifically for what this decade actually demands. We have an entire architecture of preparation for earlier stages of life. School for childhood and adolescence. Universities and apprenticeships for early adulthood. Entire industries built around supporting new parents and developing careers, and navigating the middle decades of life. And then we hand people a retirement date, and we walk away. The silence that follows is not benign. Think about what adolescence looked like before we understood it. Before we recognized that the years between 13 and 18 involved a genuine biological and psychological transformation that required guidance, support, and preparation. Those years were brutal in ways they no longer have to be simply because we now know what is happening, and we build systems around it. We tell young people what to expect. We give them language for their experience. We create structures to hold them through the transition. Nobody does that for the decade between 65 and 75. And yet the transformation happening in those years is every bit as real, every bit as biological, every bit as disorienting. And in some ways it demands more from a person, not less, because it arrives without the biological urgency of youth, without the social permission to be lost, and with decades of accumulated identity that make change feel like loss rather than growth. But here is the truth that I want to leave you with. The people who navigate this decade with the most grace are not the ones who had the most money, or the best health, or the easiest circumstances. They are the ones who entered it with intention, who understood, even roughly, what was coming, who had thought about purpose beyond occupation, who had invested in relationships before they needed them, who had begun paying attention to their physical foundation before the threshold arrived, who had spoken honestly with their families about money and care and dependence before those conversations became urgent. Intention is the variable that changes outcomes in this decade more than almost any other factor. And here is the empowering part. The genuinely empowering part. You are watching this video, which means you are paying attention, which means the preparation has already begun, whether you are 50 years from this decade or standing inside it right now. If you are in your 40s or 50s, the single most valuable thing you can do is take this decade seriously as a destination you are moving toward. Build your physical resilience now, when the returns are highest. Cultivate relationships that exist outside of your professional identity. Have honest financial conversations that go beyond generic retirement projections. Think about what gives you meaning when the structure of work is no longer there to provide it. If you are already in this decade, I want you to hear this clearly. It is not too late for any of it. The research on exercise and muscle health shows benefits beginning within weeks of starting, even in the late 60s and early 70s. Social connection rebuilt in later life carries real and measurable biological protection. The financial conversations that feel impossible to start become easier the moment they begin. And the identity work, the process of building a self that does not depend entirely on a former role for its validity, that work is available to you right now, today, in this moment. The second half of this decade, the years from 75 onward for those who come through with intention, those years are described by the people who live them well as among the most peaceful and meaningful of their entire lives. Not despite the difficulty of the decade before. Because of it. Because of what the difficulty asked them to become. This is not a conversation about decline. It never was. This is a conversation about transformation. About the most misunderstood, most undersupported, most consequential decade in human life. And understanding it, truly understanding it, changes everything about how you move through it. The responsibility does not belong to a government that thinks in 4-year cycles. It does not belong to a healthcare system designed for acute illness rather than long-term flourishing. It belongs to you. It always did. And the fact that you are still here, still listening, still paying attention to what your future actually requires, that is not a small thing. That is exactly where transformation begins.